Joining me to discuss all this today, we have our Chief Political Correspondent, David Crowe, and National Affairs Editor, Matthew Knott. Welcome to the podcast, gentlemen.
G'day, Jackie.
Hi, Jackie.
I always love having you two on as a duo. David?
So do we.
Yes, it's fun.
We are dynamic. We are dynamic.
Such a beautiful odd couple. David, yoga instructors don't usually come up on our podcast. They're a welcome addition, but why were they in the news this week?
Because they're bending over backwards to come into Australia. Sorry, I had to say it. I'm just going to get that out there straight away. I was trying to work in
a yoga pun and you just totally pipped me at the post there.
But it was the talking point about the labour shortage this week. Our colleague Angus Thompson reported it. It was on the front pages for good reason. There is a list of people, occupations, kept by the federal government on the skills that are regarded as being in shortage. And we've got a huge debate in the country at the moment about migration, who's allowed into the country and the kind of skills that we need. And it turns out that yoga instructors ended up being on the skills shortage list. Now, that gives them technically a faster track to come into the country and get skilled worker visas. Now, many people may say that's a good thing. When Angus went to some of the yoga associations in Australia, some of them didn't think that the occupation should be in shortage in that way. Mm. The main thing, though, is that it was a kind of a what the moment in the entire argument about where are we getting the skilled workers that we need and what kind of skilled workers do we need. And I think there was a fair response that said, hang on, isn't the priority construction workers, people who have the practical skills we need to fix things like the housing crisis in Australia? There are demonstrable shortages of workers in that category. And that goes to the heart of the argument about why it costs so much to get new buildings done, why it takes so long to get them built, and why that is a real choke on the solutions to the housing crisis.
Yep.
And so that's why Angus's story just ended up being the talking point on television this week, on breakfast TV shows and so forth.
Yeah. I want to talk about how migration is being so closely linked to housing in this sort of iteration of the debate that we're having. The coalition have obviously done that very explicitly. Peter Dutton did it explicitly in his budget reply speech where they pledged to cut immigration. I just wonder, it's confusing because is the housing shortage being caused by too many migrants coming in, or is, as Angus's story would sort of show, is the housing shortage being caused by not enough migrants coming in to help us build the houses that we need for the population?
There's clearly a real constraint on the supply of new homes, and the labour shortage goes to part of that, but there's also this debate that we've been seeing about planning. I have reported in the past on the fact that migration is not primarily a driver of housing shortage. But I think opinions on that have changed over time. And so my reporting of that has changed over time. I think people are now acknowledging, population experts, economists and so forth are acknowledging that with the high level of net overseas migration, it now is a pressure point for housing. The numbers are where it's at, really, because we were accustomed before the pandemic to, say, net overseas migration of 260,000 a year. In the last year, we had 528,000. Mm. Now, that's a lot of people. It's a big increase on what we've been accustomed to in the past. It's got to have an impact on housing. Mm. I don't want to exaggerate that impact, and I don't think it's fair to blame migrants for every social problem, for every problem with rental costs, for instance.
No, I mean, you and I have both written about this before, and if you're going to blame anyone, you need to blame sort of, the different levels of government for not planning the proper infrastructure and housing for the immigration intake. It's not fair on anyone, particularly not on the migrants who are coming in, I would say. Migration, I want to ask you about the business community and what they want, because that sort of goes against what a lot of the politicians are saying. Migration is set to drop next year under the Labor government following the sort of surge of migrants that we had for a few years after the pandemic when, of course, the borders were closed. The business community also says that we need more migration and not less migration, right?
That's right. And there's a big sort of pushback from business groups, particularly to Peter Dutton, who's going further and harder on cuts to migration. I guess, again, it gets to the numbers. The government says that it will cut migration, cut the net overseas migration from 528,000 last year to 395,000, and then the following year to 260,000. In other words, it'll bring it back to the pace that it was before the pandemic. And I think that's got a level of social support. It's what people are accustomed to in the past and probably can accept again. But they have to get over this spike that happened after the pandemic. Now there's a live debate, and I think it's a genuine debate, and I think it's a debate that Australia actually should have about what is the acceptable level. Peter Dutton wants to go further to 160,000 a year. And I think the business community's got a fair point. They can't see how the maths of that work.
Yeah.
How can you bring in the construction workers we need if you take the number down that far? According to one analysis I've seen, if you want all the skilled workers Australia needs and you want a humanitarian intake, family reunion, you can't take in hardly any foreign students at all if you take it down to 160,000 a year. So that's when it becomes a real hammer blow to the economy.
Yeah, because the university, the higher education sector is such a, what is it, our second largest industry, export industry? It's huge. Yeah. Matt, I just want to bring you in here because we do have these two opposing forces, pushing against each other in the debate. On the one hand, the coalition is promising to cut immigration, and Labor is too, to ease pressure on housing and services, and especially in the cities. But on the other hand, we have an ageing population, a lot of skills shortages, and we need migrants to help us. Do you see, taking a step back, do you see that either side of politics is genuinely trying to balance these two opposing pressures?
Well, what your question's getting at there is this strange aspect of the debate is that we're now using population really as a proxy for housing policy. Yep. And that's what's driving the big concern is young people not being able to buy houses, a shortage of houses on the market. And instead of doing something about that directly, the government's trying to cut back population. So what the policies we've seen on housing from the federal government have been pretty small scale, building Australia housing fund. I think everyone acknowledges that that's not going anywhere near what is necessary. A lack of supply is the big issue with housing. A lot of this has to do with state governments. But we've obviously had the huge controversies over recent years about negative gearing and the capital gains tax, and it would be very unpopular to try to bring people's house prices down. So instead, we're having this debate about population, people who can't vote. No one's going to lose votes from non-citizens. Yeah. Also getting into this question of many of the people are students who aren't really buying houses. They're on student accommodation or very cheap rental properties in the inner city. So I think it's all a way of not having the debate we need to have about housing.
David, what do you think? Do you see any politicians out there on either side of politics or all sides of politics who are genuinely trying to say to people, look, I understand that immigration is an issue and it's a cost of living and housing shortage pressure, but we also need working age workers and skilled workers, and we need to bring them in via migration?
You do hear some of those arguments from federal ministers. You've got Skills Minister Brendan O'Connor talks about the need for more skills, including training Australians, but also bringing in some who are needed from overseas. Claire O'Neill, as the Home Affairs Minister, does talk about trying to get the balance here, but I think the government is generally under pressure to show that it will cut the numbers. And I do think that the primary goal has got to be assuring Australians that the numbers are under control, that they're not going to keep blowing out. And so what you lose in that is some of the fundamental truths, which are things like in its aged care policy, the government wants more nurses in aged care.
Yeah.
Where are those nurses coming from?
Yeah.
Anybody who's been to a hospital lately will know where those nurses come from. They come from overseas. So there's a need to really grapple with that debate. And I don't think that the solution can be simply poaching nurses from overseas. Why aren't we training more of the nurses in other countries so that we're helping those countries as well as gaining future workers? That's a very difficult issue.
You mean bringing them in sort of temporarily as temporary migrants and then training them up, and then they get to go back to their home countries and take those skills there?
Yes, if there was overseas students, for instance, there is an argument that we should be putting a priority in the overseas student program for the students that we need and other countries really need. What's happened with overseas students is one of the big growth sectors has been business courses.
Right.
Particularly for Chinese overseas students, for instance. That helps Chinese back in their own country because with the right qualification from a top-tier university, they can then move into one of the big cities in China and their career prospects improve. But is that what Australia needs?
Right.
Australia may need more foreign students who come in to learn nursing. They can go back to their own countries and improve healthcare in their home countries, or they can go on to become skilled workers in Australia that the country needs.
That does sound like a good idea. What do the Greens have to say on all this, if anything? I mean, they have really been at the vanguard of talking about housing as an issue, particularly for younger Australians, haven't they?
And they never connect it with migration. Now, I'm not saying that they should. I think that that's a very fraught issue. There are some realities in the numbers to deal with, but I'm not saying that housing has to be about migration every time the subject comes up. But I have found it interesting when Adam Bandt's been interviewed as the Greens leader and when other Greens have been interviewed, they're very reluctant to take a position on what the net overseas migration intake should be or whether it should be reduced. And in the past, the Greens have had positions such as greater acceptance of refugees with, in theory, very large numbers of people coming into Australia. And they haven't disavowed that. And I do think that that's... Look, I'll be, I guess, more direct than I might otherwise be. I think it's a failure of the Greens here. Any party that seeks to go to the election asking for votes should have a position on migration.
Yeah.
It's a mainstream concern.
So the Greens and the Business Council of Australia are in a strange alliance supporting a big Australia.
But the Greens don't say it explicitly. Usually they duck the question. And I don't think that's good enough for a party that's seeking votes at the next election.
Matt, I want to segue now to your story this week that the government made an announcement, a very interesting announcement on military recruitment, also to do with taking in people from overseas.
Yes. Now, this is an idea that's been floating around for quite a while and building steam over recent months. The government's been dropping hints that they were going to do something in this area. And then this week we had the official announcement that the government is going to start opening up the Australian Defence Force to people who are not Australian citizens. Now, the policy itself is pretty simple at this stage. In the first instance, from the middle of this year, it's going to be open to New Zealand permanent residents. And then from next year, it'll be open to permanent residents who live in Australia who are citizens of the Five Eyes nation. So that's also the US, UK and Canada. It's pretty simple. Most people support it. Most experts, military experts support this. But the way it was announced and communicated to the public became very messy.
Yeah, so tell us about that, because there was a bit of confusion about exactly what was promised. David?
There was total confusion, and I think it was embarrassing for the government. My initial take was that it was just a misstatement by Matt Keogh, the Defence Personnel Minister, because, of course, he suggested that it could be a broader intake from countries outside the Five Eyes. There was even talk about Pacific nations, I think. And the government didn't seem to have clarity about its announcement on the morning it was making this announcement. This idea isn't totally new this week. Matt has written about it in the past. It's been talked about as an option for the Defence Forces. But there was this furious pushback, very instant pushback from the coalition saying you can't just accept anybody from anywhere into the ADF. And the government, I think, realised that it had better clarify this and limit the program to the Five Eyes nations ASAP. And that's what they did. But it's now clear that they didn't have that nailed down when they released the policy. They briefed some newspapers on it before it was announced in the morning, and the briefings made clear that it was generally more open. I think that this goes to fundamental competence. You shouldn't have mystery about that when you're announcing your policy. And we're seeing that too often from some ministers in the government. They've really got to improve their game on some of these basic issues. Get the policy right before it's out there. They're 2 years into government. They should be better than that.
It seems like a pretty simple job. Matt, what did the Coalition have to say about this proposal, and what have they said about similar proposals in the past? Because I know you've interviewed Andrew Hastie on this.
Yeah, I found this interesting. I did a story on this issue in May last year. It wasn't really being spoken about at that time. This was when the big Defence Strategic Review came out, which said that Australia has a really big problem with Defence Force recruitment and we're going to need innovative solutions to address that. And I did some ringing around, and what people said was this is an idea whose time has come in terms of allowing foreigners to serve in the military. And I spoke to Andrew Hastie, and he was pretty supportive of it. He said this is something the government should be looking at. If we bring people here to be investors, to work in other fields, and they want to serve, why shouldn't they? We need to boost numbers. Of course, it's different now that the government's actually announced it, as we said, in this rather messy context. The opposition not only has criticised the government for the way it communicated the policy, but has also said we're withholding our support for this. They're saying it's a sign of failure that the government's resorting to this policy rather than trying to attract Australians into the force. So I think there's a bit of inconsistency there from Andrew Hastie on the substance of the policy, given in the past he expressed a willingness to support it.
Matt, you just spoke about the recruitment problem that the ADF has, which has been sort of identified by that big review that you just spoke about. Why aren't people joining the armed forces in the numbers that they used to? Why does the ADF have a recruitment problem?
So it is a serious problem. So the latest figures that came out this week is that the Defence Force is 4,400 people short of its personnel targets. And that's a big problem. That's on the current levels. But what the Defence Force is trying to do is to add an extra 18,500 people to the Defence Force by 2040. That's a 30% increase on where it is now. And what they're doing is really battling to even stay steady. So major things have to change in this area. A thing that is well established is that Defence Force recruitment is very strongly correlated with the unemployment rate. So when unemployment is high, people are more willing to look at joining the Defence Force. When unemployment is low, like it is now, it's very hard to get people to join the military. There's intense competition from fields like the construction sector, the oil and gas sector, places in the private sector where you can earn a lot of money. The fact of the military, of course, is that it's potentially very dangerous. Long time spent away, perhaps from friends and family. So it's hard for the ADF to compete with what the private sector can offer, a more comfortable life often in the private sector. So we're seeing different measures from the government. This one is going to be pretty small, and the government says that they're only expecting to add about another 350 people to the military from this non-citizens announcement.
That's not going to tip the scales at all, is it, that kind of number?
No, exactly not. They're doing other things in terms of paying these $50,000 retention bonuses for people who stay in the military, and they've changed some of the rules around, for example, how fit you have to be to join the military. Pretty much everyone who joined used to have to pass demanding physical fitness tests involving all these push-ups and exercises, even if what you were doing day to day didn't require you to be an SAS warrior. So they've cut back on some of that, even about whether you had braces. Sometimes you couldn't join the Defence Force. So they're cutting back on this to make it easier to join.
What about the gender balance within the military? Obviously, traditionally it was always very male-dominated, and I know that there have been efforts in recent decades to attract more women into the military. Have they been successful? Is it a sort of attractive career for women?
There are women. I've been working on a story about submariners because we're trying to get many more people into working in submarines with the AUKUS Pact. And several that I did speak to were female submariners, who are living in close quarters on a submarine, which a few decades ago wouldn't have been possible. Something people in this space do talk about is the need for female leadership. There aren't many female leaders in the ADF. Some positions have come up recently and they have gone to men. For example, the head of the ADF, the vice head, the head of the Army, Navy, Air Force, these are all men, and their deputies are as well. So there would be an opportunity there to put a woman in and send that really strong signal from the government and the military itself that this is a career where women can excel and take leadership positions.
I've got to say, I don't get to interrupt many defence people. It's not my round, it's Matt's. But I have interviewed the chief defence scientist, Tanya Monroe. Now, she's a leader within defence, but admittedly she's on the scientific side of defence rather than, running Air Force operations. But they do have these leaders, but they need to do more, clearly.
Yeah, to make sure that women feel welcomed. Just quickly, David, does this recruitment problem we have in the ADF, does that, given that we're supposed to be ramping up our military capabilities in response to an increasingly assertive China, given we have the AUKUS Pact, I mean, how much of a looming national security problem is this?
I think it's a huge problem. I think there's a huge problem for Australia in building up the capability that we all think we need, that the government is telling us we need for the future. And we see it across so many parts of society and the economy. We can't build enough houses. Can we really build the nuclear submarines we say we need?
Yeah.
Are we really going to be able to get all the people we need for this? We are looking at a future of labour shortages that affect us in so many different ways across society. And even if the unemployment rate changes, I think that future is a long-term future because you look at demographic trends that indicate it's a long-term future. And getting the balance right on migration, getting the balance right on the ADF is going to be an incredible challenge. And I think we're only just seeing the start of it.
I was just going to add that this is a conversation in terms of the military that's happening around the world. We saw during the British election campaign Rishi Sunak's announcement about national service. Now, that was pretty widely derided as a desperate play from a government that's almost certainly going to lose. But various countries in Europe are reintroducing forms of national service. The government here has said they're not planning on going down that path. They're using these other approaches we spoke about before. But this is something that's affecting countries around the world.
Yeah, national service, bring it back. Although I don't know if as long as they need to slash the push-up requirements if they're going to recruit the likes of me. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you both.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks, Jackie.